But things ain't so bad, 'cause I've got a Galaxy 500.
All right, like the song says, things ain't so bad, folks. I don't know about you, but hopefully you're hanging out in a place that's kind of cool or getting outside some. Luckily, this is where I get to be recording these videos, give you a little view of my view right now. So, unfortunately, the thing that is going on right now is migration in birds. And one of the things I like to do this time of year particularly is do these labs with y'all and go out and see what new birds are showing up each day. Can't do that with you now, but hopefully with lab assignments you're getting out there and you'll find some of these birds yourselves. Use the field guide, the field checklist that's on D2L. I think it's called the checklist for birds of East Texas. I've got it in the content. It has a nice breakdown of the dates at which, or at least kind of the months, and kind of earlier or later in the month when some of these birds should start showing up. So that'll give you some hint. If you're not in East Texas right now, there's going to be a checklist like that for whatever area you're in. So it's just going to take some Google searching to find that kind of thing. But yeah, unfortunately the Highland trip is going to be canceled because of the virus. But just get out there as much as you can, but obviously be safe. So let's talk about migration today. So migration is used a couple different ways in biology. It can be used in a way to describe various aspects of evolutionary biology. But here we're talking about the regular seasonal movement of birds from breeding grounds to non-breeding grounds. And it's tied to breeding in areas with predictable access to abundant resources. And sometimes these migration patterns can be incredibly long. So on an annual basis, Arctic terns will make these types of movements. These are two different individuals going all the way from the Arctic to the Antarctic and back. Excited Carolina in there. I hope you can hear it. So why migrate? Let's talk about the ultimate factors and the proximate factors that can lead to the evolution of this behavior. Well, the ultimate factor really is tied to the birds, again, moving into these breeding grounds and increasing their breeding success and the nesting success of their young by taking advantage of the seasonal excess of resources available during the breeding season. So what are the proximate factors associated with the timing of when birds will migrate north and south? Because that's the typical pattern we'll talk about. There are other patterns, however. It's usually the key factor for most temperate zone birds is it's associated with changes in photoperiod. And we talked about this a little bit earlier with regard to hormonal changes in birds, how it's regulated by the hypothalamus. Sensing light changes, increasing day length, decreasing day length. Those are what stimulate different hormones that can be associated with triggering molt, reproductive growth of gonads, and also migratory restlessness, which is a behavior we'll talk about here in a minute. So changes in photoperiod are the key, but it can also be the exact days in which birds will migrate can be fine-tuned by things like weather. So if a bird, remember they have really good abilities associated with their ears, their auditory system, with detecting barometric pressure changes. And so they want to make sure that they don't leave at a time, say crossing the Gulf of Mexico headed north, in which there's a cold front coming through where they'd have to fight a headwind. That's going to be a big time problem and lead to a pattern what we call a fallout, where they all end up in the ocean. So definitely don't want to do that. So they do pay attention and will adjust their timing a day or so associated with patterns like that. They can also detect wind patterns by hearing when movement off the landscape using infrasound. And also birds will track temperature changes to make some fine tunes of when they will leave and when they will arrive, both on the breeding ground and when they'll also head down to the wintering ground. And we'll see how climate change is affecting that in birds here at the end of this lecture. Now, not all birds do migrate. Many birds are resident. They basically keep the same breeding and non-breeding range. They may give up their strict territoriality that they use in the breeding season and have an expanded home range where they can even flock together. So a good example of that would be the northern cardinals. But even migration has variation in its patterns. Some birds are obligate migrants in which there's a very predictable pattern of migration between relatively specific breeding and non-breeding grounds. And this was demonstrated with white-crowned sparrows that were wintering in California. They wanted to test kind of how specific their navigation skills were to get to very precise areas. So they took birds from California here, and they put them on planes and flew an individual to Louisiana, Baton Rouge, and then they also flew some to the banding lab in Maryland, let them overwinter there, and then basically wanted to test the idea, can they make it back to their breeding grounds? And sure enough, these birds have very specific areas in which they will nest every year. They show a high degree of what's called philopatry. Philopatry means really staying into one specific area for breeding year to year. And these birds were able to calculate where they had been moved to and change their navigation orientation so that they could get back to their regular breeding grounds, which is pretty fascinating. We'll talk a lot about the navigation skills in the next lecture. Well, not all birds are obligate migrants like that, where all the individuals have very specific, distinct migratory patterns. Some birds are facultative migrants, in which the extent of movement between breeding grounds and non-breeding grounds can vary depending on resource availability year to year. And so that's shown here. If this is the breeding ground indicated in green, you see that in some years they may migrate south just a little bit, in other years they may grow a little bit farther, and some years they go a long way. And they're basically tracking the resources. So a good example of this are the yellow-rumped warblers shown here on the right. And you can see that as prey availability changes, the greater the prey availability, the greater the density of warblers. And if there's not a lot of prey availability, the birds aren't going to stay in that area. And so these kind of blue boxes I have shown over here, they may even show within a season changes, kind of a gradual migration. They may stop first, kind of a short area, stay there for a while, for a month or so, and then continue moving on. And this is why down here in East Texas, some years we have large numbers of birds like yellow-rumped warblers. In general, we have quite a few of those. But other birds like one of the labs we saw golden crown kinglets. Some years we don't see very many of those at all, and other years we see quite a few of them. So that's an example of these facultative migrants. There can also be variation within a species based on sex and age. So this was an interesting study on dark-eyed juncos. And let's look at this figure in more detail. Let's look at this side of the graph first. There's different mortality associated with the distance individuals migrate. Basically, migration is dangerous. And for migratory birds, migration is the most dangerous period of life. Well, in this species, that's particularly associated with young birds. Young birds are more likely to suffer mortality for every unit of distance they migrate. Okay, so that, therefore, selects for shorter migration distances by young birds of both male and female. So, let's see that that's one selected force. We should see that probably the young birds should stay closer to the breeding ground than the older birds. That's one thing that we're going to be dealing with. Let's jump over here to the right now. We also see that there are some reasons, other reasons why you might want to stay closer to the breeding ground and not migrate as far south in the winter. Remember, we talked about resident advantage in territorial setup. If you get there first and you start defending that territory, you have a better shot of keeping it for yourself. So that's clearly going to be advantage for males, not necessarily much for females. Okay, and that's particularly true of the young males who have probably less dominance, less abilities to, if the footing was even in fighting for a territory, they would be kind of getting the short end of the stick there. So this also selects for shorter migration distances by young males, particularly young males, but just males in general, but particularly young males. So young birds, particularly young males, should want to stay pretty close to home. Okay, now that's going to cause pretty high density associated with those northern wintering grounds. So this is going to therefore select for increased migration distances for the older class birds, particularly older females, so that they have less competition and greater overwinter survivorship. So very cool study showing you how complex some of these cases of facultative migration can be. All right, now don't get facultative migration confused with partial migrants. Partial migrants show a similar thing, but oftentimes these are fairly well genetically constrained. So different individuals in the population have different genetic-based propensities to either migrate or not, and to migrate different distances. So you may have one genotype that is associated with residence. You may have different other genotypes that are associated with, okay, you're going to migrate a short distance, you're going to migrate a medium distance or a long distance, and that set up different wintering grounds. But partial migrants oftentimes are based on very distinct genotypes that control that behavior. It's not facultative. And also don't confuse migration with nomadic wandering, or sometimes what are called eruptive movements, where birds don't have predictable patterns of where they go seasonally or geographically. They're just moving to track unpredictable resources. So red crossbills do this. They have breeding grounds that they will then leave, tracking the crops of pine and spruce cones as they develop in different parts of mountain ranges. And sometimes they'll actually even make it down here in East Texas during the wintertime when cone crops fail in areas of, say, the Rocky Mountains. But these are very unpredictable movements. All right, so again, let's get back to the ultimate reasons associated with migration. Why are some birds resident and some birds migrant? Well, if you're going to address this question, you have to think about residents being of two different types. You've got birds that stay up here in the temperate zone year-round, so those are the temperate residents. And then you have tropical species that just stay in the tropics. All right, let's look at the pattern associated with temperate residents first. Crap, sorry. So temperate residents tend to have really high productivity. Okay, so as soon as conditions are right to breed, they can start breeding. So they can have multiple nests, and they can take advantage of the seasonal superabundance of resources associated with the high seasonality and high productivity associated with northern latitude habitats. Now, by having those multiple nests and multiple clutches, they can produce a lot of young, but their overwinter survivorship is oftentimes very low. Winters can be harsh, and the juvenile survivorship is very low. So they're balancing this high productivity with low survivorship of both adults and juveniles. Let's jump over and look at the tropical residents now. Productivity in the tropics per nest is relatively low. They actually do not have large clutches, so a comparable species of, say, flycatcher up in North America may lay a clutch of 6 eggs. 6 or more eggs. Down in the tropics, we're talking probably 2 eggs. So they have lower nest productivity in that regard, and they may nest a couple of times a year. They can spread out their breeding season, but again, per year they're not producing as many offspring as a closely related bird in the temperate zone. However, lifetime reproductive success could be quite high because they have really high adult survivorship and much higher juvenile survivorship as well. So their lifespan is longer. So they're getting that nice trade-off in that regard. Well, what about migrants? Migrants can take advantage, again, of the seasonal abundance of resources in the northern temperate zone. But they're not getting there quite as early, and they can't stay as late because they got to fatten up and get the resources to migrate back. So they have moderate productivity, but they do have higher survivorship compared to the temperate residents because they're escaping those harsh winter conditions. Not quite as high as the tropical residents because, as I mentioned, the migration act itself is extremely dangerous, and this is when most of these birds are going to die. Okay, so both the adults and the juveniles have moderate survivorship, mainly due to the increased chance of dying during migration itself. So, how have we studied migration? One of the oldest ways of doing this is putting bands on birds. This is high effort, very low return. You can band hundreds and hundreds of birds and get very few recaptures. Now, it kind of depends, again, on the species you're dealing with. If you're dealing with an obligate migrant that has very specific philopatric needs, you can recapture those birds year after year. We've done this with painted buntings in the past. So you can get some information on timing of movement and also movement patterns. Where do they breed, but then also where do they end up migrating? What pathways do they migrate if someone else picks one up during migration, find them dead, for example, or another banding operation, capture them on route or on their wintering ground. But again, it's a very hit and miss. It's kind of like finding a needle in a haystack. And just to point out, this bird right here, the bands we're talking about that would be important for studying migration are just these silver bands. To get these, you have to get a banding permit from the banding lab. It's run by the U.S. Geological Survey, actually. The other bands here, the color bands, those are more for behavioral studies, where you're trying to give individuals individual markings, so you can figure out which specific male is in which territory or which female is associated with which nest, what are the breeding pairs, things like that. More high-tech ways of tracking migration include using satellite trackers, but the problem with these is battery life is relatively low and the batteries are heavy. So you tend to have to use these on larger birds. You don't want to put radio transmitters or any kind of satellite tracker on a bird. You don't want it to be more than 3% of their bird's weight, or it really affects their flight. Remember, birds have evolved a lot of adaptations to keep themselves as lightweight as possible. So this is just one example of the fine-scale data you can get off of this. This is an osprey that the researchers called Martha. No. Left Martha's Vineyard. I forget what the name of this bird was. But anyway, it shows you how this bird has moved on a daily basis, how far, where it stops. And this is valuable information, particularly for birds that may be of conservation concern. We'll talk about the need to preserve habitats along the way. But again, there's kind of limitations on sizes and weights of these things, and they're also very expensive. Again, using radio transmitters, again, you still have the battery life and weight issues, and these are really only good for tracking short distances or if you can actually follow them, say, in a plane for a day. But you're not going to be able to track long-distance migrants with radio transmitters. This is more for looking at kind of short-scale, smaller-scale geographic movements. Geolocators, relatively newer technology where you can put these devices on the birds that track photo period basically, and so you can get this information and see where the birds were on a daily basis based upon photo period changes and date by correlating those. The problem with this is it's not transmitting that information. The information is actually stored on the device itself, and so you have to recapture the birds to get those data. So here's a painted bunting that has one of these devices. Surprisingly, one of the high-tech ways of doing this is actually pretty old tech, using Doppler radar. You can track flocks of migrating birds and track their relative density and speed to understand mass migration movements. And unfortunately, this data, I mean, we've had a long-term data on this because Doppler radar is old technology. We've documented about a 50% decline in spring migrants from the 60s to the 80s, and it's even worse now. I'm going to have y'all read a paper later in this semester talking about just really how bad bird populations are globally. Again, you can get some rough idea of the birds, like is it warblers that are migrating together, is it ducks, is it shorebirds, based upon the speed at which they're moving. And as you see them moving over, using the radar, if you go outside, some birds will produce these specific species-specific vocalizations as they're migrating, and so you could actually identify them to species in combination using this technology. Feather chemistry can also be a very valuable way of defining the general area in which they could be wintering on their wintering grounds. What we're looking at is isotope ratios of what are called stable isotopes. Various isotopes of different elements can be used for this type of thing. Hydrogen, in some cases, carbon and nitrogen also have stable isotopes. And looking at the ratios of these, geologists and chemists have come up with very detailed geographic maps of how these isotope ratios vary geographically. And so if you pluck one of these feathers from a bird that's landed in a breeding ground, but that feather grew because of the pre-alternate molt occurring on the wintering ground, then you just look at what those isotope ratios are, you look at the map, and you say, oh, it's got to be somewhere in this region. And this has been very important for conservation work on things like black-throated blue warblers. Black-throated blue warblers have certain populations in the U.S. that appear to be doing very well. If you look at their breeding success, different populations have comparable breeding success. But it's pretty clear that some populations are declining, and so that can only mean if their breeding success is comparable, the winter survivorship or their migration mortality must differ. And what this has found is the populations in the southern U.S., which were the ones that are having the biggest population problems, using this feather chemistry were found to be wintering on the island of Hispaniola, where neighboring the Dominican Republic and this is associated with, in those areas, really heavy deforestation. And so it again is a nice tool to figure out exactly where these birds are migrating and what the problems are on their wintering grounds. So as I mentioned, I've been kind of describing birds as moving north and south, and most birds are latitudinal migrants, and so here are some of the rough flyways that are associated with migration. So the Pacific flyway, the Mississippi flyway, the Atlantic flyway in North America, but you can see also north-south primarily flyways in Eurasia. The East Atlantic is kind of interesting because there is a north-south component, but there's also a very broad east-west component in the northern hemisphere. There are birds, however, that are altitudinal migrants, so basically tracking resources up and down mountain ranges, going from lowlands to higher altitude areas. This is seen in a lot of tropical hummingbirds and frugivorous birds like the resplendent quetzal shown here on the bottom right. these quetzals basically are tracking the development of native avocado plants, these teeny tiny avocados that is their primary source of food, and they will move from breeding to non-breeding grounds in different elevations, tracking how these things are ripening in different seasons. So regardless of the geographic directionality associated with migration, birds that are traveling long distances oftentimes do follow major geographical features like river valleys, coastlines, traveling along or on mountain ranges. And one interesting fact that we're going to see over and over again in examples coming up is that the way they migrate in the spring, north, and then the way they migrate south in the fall can be very different in large part. And this is oftentimes represented in a loop pattern, so it's called loop migration, and that you can see here with this Connecticut warbler. There's another example of a loop migration in the European cuckoo, going from Europe down into Africa. The southern fall route is much more eastern and more western in the spring migration. Back up a minute. And just think about this. So if you're a conservation biologist, this is a problem, right? So if you're a conservation biologist, first of all, for a migratory species, you have to be preserving breeding habitat, wintering habitat, and the habitat that they use in their route during migration, because they do have to have these stopover areas. Well, now loop migrants make it even harder because you can't just preserve certain habitats for stopover sites in the south migration. You got to also have it for the north migration because they're using different areas. So these birds are not making it easy for us. Now, some birds have leapfrog migration. So this is a situation where you have, it's a partial migratory species, as I was mentioning before, where you have probably some pretty strong heritability patterns where there are different genotypes associated with different migration patterns within a species, but different basically subpopulations within that. So in this example of this thrush, oh no, sorry, that's looks like a hair sparrow. You have a resident population, okay, and then over here you've got a short distance migrant going from this area of North America up into the inside passageway associated with Alaska. Okay, you have a more southern breeding, wintering population, and a more northern breeding population here. In part of that's Canada, part of that's Alaska at this point. I think I know at least that part's Alaska. And then you have this other population that's going even much farther than that. Now, what's interesting about this is because these are different genetic propensities, the degree of allopatric here, if it persists, this is how you can form allopatric patterns of speciation. All right. Sometimes birds will fly over large areas of desert or ocean in which they really don't have any options for landing. Ooh, did you hear that? That was a belted kingfisher down by my pond. So here we see the Blackpoll Warbler. It's fall migration. It flies way out into the Pacific, to the Atlantic to take advantage of the trade winds, the northeast trade winds, in its flight down into, say, the Lesser Antilles and the northern part of South America. This is an 86-hour flight, and they're flying over some very inhospitable habitat. They're not like ducks that they could just land on the water, so they really have to fuel up for this. But there are some advantages to flying over these inhospitable areas. They don't have resources. You can't really stop, but there aren't many aerial predators, so they don't have to worry about predation. And if the weather is right and they're taking advantage of these tailwinds, it actually saves them energy. However, if the weather patterns change and they have to fly into a headwind, this is when you can get them basically just not making it and falling out. Fallouts occur where birds that have made it through these stressful times, just the first landmass they come, they just kind of fall out in these big massive groups. They're just completely tuckered out. Or boats or oil rigs will fall out on those, and they just look like Christmas tree ornaments hanging from the shrouds and the other lines that are on the boats. As I mentioned, migration is dangerous, and most migrants, they suffer seasonally their highest rates of mortality during the migration, either the fall or spring migration, and that's what is shown here for these 3 different species of raptors. In the summer, they have relatively low mortality. Winter, they have relatively low mortality. But look at their fall migration and their spring migrations. They have elevated rates of mortality. Don't worry about the specifics of the species. Just you know, what we're looking at here is that they have higher mortality during migration. So I mentioned these stopover and staging habitats. So when a bird is migrating, oftentimes they do have to stop and refuel. Songbirds, passerines in the suborder, the Aucenes, can fly, a few hundred kilometers. Then they have to stop and refuel for a day or so. Shorebirds can typically fly longer and farther before they have to stop over, but they also require a couple of stopover sites in their long distance migrations. And this picture right here is showing you the shorebird network of important sites for shorebirds migrating between North and South America. And you may notice one of these areas right here, that Bolivar Flats is right on the western edge of the Bolivar Peninsula. So if you go down to High Island, Crystal Beach, that's where you see Bolivar Flats, right before you get on the ferry that goes to Galveston. That is an incredibly important habitat for shorebirds that are migrating. An immense number of birds you can see that is right smack dab in the middle of where most of these birds are migrating focusing before they're migrating south. And so it's a massive, and also going north. So it's a massively important conservation area for migrating shorebirds. And so there's been a lot of collaboration between different NGOs and government organizations to preserve these habitats because it is a big time conservation challenge for migratory birds. You have to preserve wintering grounds, you have to preserve breeding grounds, and also these stopover habitats. Here's just an example of a specific species in which we have some pretty good data showing you, again, they've got this loop migration, movement of individuals, and where they tend to concentrate and stop over sites. So it gives us some data on where we should be putting our money to preserve these birds. So red knots, for example, feed a lot on horseshoe crab eggs. They time their breeding so that when horseshoe crabs are breeding, they can feed on the eggs in Delaware Bay. But there's been a lot of people over harvesting horseshoe crabs themselves, and this has led to steep declines in red knots, and so there's had to been some regulation to limit horseshoe crab catches to bring these populations back up. So we've been talking seasonally when birds migrate and what kind of changes that, but on a daily basis, when do birds migrate? Most passerines are nocturnal migrants, so it's just kind of weird, you may think, because most passerines on a normal daily activity, they're diurnal, right? They're active during the day. But by flying at night, you can take advantage of lower wind situations. Usually it's safer, associated with reduced predation. And then when you stop migration on maybe a daily basis or every other day, when you land, it's daytime, and then you can forage. You're during your normal foraging time, so you can kind of restock at that point. Swallows and swifts, however, tend to be more diurnal migrants. Hey, I just see my very first hummingbird at my feeder here. And that makes sense, right? So they're already flying, and they're continuous flight foragers. And so as they're migrating, as they come across swarms of insects, they can feed. Raptors are diurnal migrants, and that makes sense because of the importance of using thermals for gliding. This is a photograph of a group of broadwing hawks and a few Swainson's hawks in Veracruz, Mexico. I was actually able to go to a North American Ornithological Conference in Veracruz a few years ago and actually witness this, and it's astounding to see the hundreds and hundreds of hawks that you can see using these thermals during their migration. Waterfowl and shorebirds, oftentimes they'll just do both, and they can fly for much more extended periods of time. So they pretty much just get up and go. How high do they fly? Don't worry about the details associated with these different groups and their heights. What I want you to know is most it's below, between around 1,000 and 1,500 meters. They're going to be below that. However, when they're migrating over water, they tend to fly a little bit higher. But this relatively low altitude does lend to problems associated with a communication tower kill issues. The birds, particularly in the fall migration, if there's a lot of fog, they are sometimes attracted to the lights associated with these towers. They fly around the towers, and they don't usually strike the towers, but the guy wires that support the towers. While they're flying around like a moth to a flame, they hit these wires, and there can be some really substantial kills of thousands of birds at some of these towers on these particularly cloudy nights. It tends to be more of a problem when these towers are up on hills, and of course that's one of the big areas that communication companies want to put these because they're more efficient in that way. There's also some concern that wind turbines might be associated with increased mortality of migrant birds, and there is data to support that. It's not as bad as the communication towers, though. I like seeing these newer communication towers that are more kind of like the Eiffel Tower or the freestanding ones that don't have the guy wires. Those are less likely to be a problem as opposed to the really tall, skinny ones that do have these wires supporting them. The wind turbines, they do kill birds, but not as much. And if you think about the trade-offs associated with sustainable energy and habitat and climate change differences, I think that's a trade-off we're willing to make. The problem with the wind turbines, though, is bats. Bats appear to be hit really hard by these wind turbines. All right, so there's a behavior that birds show during migration which is called zugunruhe. It's a German term that translates into migratory restlessness. And it's been shown in laboratory studies to correlate quite nicely to the distance in which these birds would normally be migrating at night. So basically what they do is in the cages, they just hop in a certain direction against the cage, like they would be trying and fluttering and flying in that direction. And the longer they do that, it's correlated with how long they would have been flying that night. And that's what we're seeing here in different species, A through H here. In some cases, you see multiple letters associated with different populations of the same species. But there's a pretty nice correlation between the number of half hours with zugunruhe, this nocturnal activity, and the distance this species normally flies during migration. And in species that have partial migration, different populations oftentimes are migrating different distances, and we see that there's consistent, predictable zugunruhe differences between individuals of these different populations, and this is based on heritable variation, different genes associated with individuals in these populations. So here we've got a species in which you have some resident populations that are not going to show zugunruhe, and then you have breeding and non-breeding areas of the migratory subpopulation, and there are different genes associated with the zugunruhe seen in the latter. So zugunruhe is definitely a heritable thing that we see in birds. But some other things that birds have to do in preparation for migration is eat a lot, and this is called hyperphagia. Small birds can actually double their weight prior to migration, and what they're doing is they're putting on what's called migratory fat. Fat is far more efficient energy source per unit weight than carbohydrates or protein, and so this high fat is basically what's going to fuel them during their migration. And if you look at the fat that they have, long-range migrants, their body can be composed in some cases as much as a third or almost a half of their body just being migratory fat, compared to non-migrants in cold areas may have 15%. They're fairly chunky, but tropical birds, man, they're just really lean. They don't need that fat. And remember, you only want to put this fat on if you really need it, because it is going to add weight to you. And birds want to minimize weight as much as possible. So it tells you the importance of energy stores during migration. And these fat scores can be used in migratory studies where you may set up banding stations along the migratory route to detect maybe the health of migrants of different age classes or sexes. So here we've got some yellow-rumped warblers, and the bird on the right, clearly you can see that subcutaneous fat. That's a healthy individual. Boy, the one on the left is really hurting. That's a very lean individual, and it's probably going to have to slow its migration down, forage a little bit more before it moves. So it's probably going to get to the breeding area later, and that's going to affect its fitness, if it survives at all. So it takes a lot of energy to do this. How far will this energy take them? Well, remember the Blackpoll Warbler I mentioned earlier, flying over the northern Atlantic. It's estimated they could fly. It took them about 87 hours to make that journey, but their fat stores are predicted that they could fly for 100 hours and take them about 2,500 kilometers. Our little ruby-throated hummingbird, which one I just saw here, is estimated to be able to fly about 26 hours to make it across the Gulf of Mexico, or about 1,000 kilometers. So that's the main thing that they're using. Birds will also use carbohydrates if they can get them, but that's going to be used pretty soon after leaving a foraging area, and they're going to be relying on fat. Once the fat burns out, they will use the proteins in their muscles, break that down as an emergency fuel source when the lipids run out in muscles and organs, but they don't touch the brain and the lungs because that would be counterproductive, obviously. And some birds go through some other pretty remarkable morphological changes in preparation for migration. So this is looking at black-necked grebes, which have kind of a complex migratory pattern. They can actually have 3 phases of migration. And you see that during these migration phases, they tend to have relatively high increases in breast muscle tissue. Makes sense, right? That's what you're using for powered flight. Not really using your legs, and so you see a drop in, not a perfect here, but there is a little bit of a drop in leg musculature. You're not eating a lot when you're flying, so you have a reduction in digestive tissue, but you're definitely going to be using your heart a lot, so look at the heart musculature, how that increases during migration. So it turns out that evolutionary behavior can evolve. And we'll talk about kind of the broad patterns and how quickly these things can change. I've already mentioned that zugunruhe is a heritable behavior. So is hyperphagia, and actually some aspects of navigation appear to have a strong genetic basis to them as well. And this actually allows migration to evolve relatively quickly, meaning that it is an evolutionarily plastic trait. We've got several examples of this. House finches, pictured here on the right, are normally a Western North America species, but they were introduced into Eastern North America, into New York area, and they actually evolved migration behavior into the southern U.S. during the winters in about 20 years. So relatively fast evolution of migratory behaviors. Partial migratory species that again have different genetics for different breeding propensities can show changes in the relative numbers of individuals of those different genes. So the genotypes can change in the frequency of which is the dominant, which are subordinate ones, depending on the selective advantages of one or the other as climate changes and as seasonal patterns change. So you may end up having lots of migratory individuals for a few seasons, and then you may end up seeing more an increase in residents a decade later. So, if you talk about a species that is a neotropical migrant, so it's migrating between the tropics for wintering and northern areas for breeding, which came first? If they came from a resident species, did they evolve from a tropical origin, like shown down here in C, where there were tropical species that said, like, well, why are we living here the year round? Let's migrate up here, and I'm being anthropomorphic, but you know what I'm saying. So was there a subpopulation of individuals that evolved a genetic propensity to migrate up here in the breeding season, took advantage of that, and so it was a selective advantage? Or the alternative is these neotropical migrants are derived from an ancestral species that was a temperate zone resident, and they're like looking around going, man, it's cold up here. There's not a lot of food. Let's head down south and take advantage of that. The advantage of wintering in the tropics. Well, if you look at the phylogenetics of groups that have a commonality, a variety of migrant and resident species, it looks like B is supported. So at the base of these clades, there are lots of Nearctic, temperate zone resident species at the base of these clades, and that migration into the tropics has evolved independently in quite a few of those situations. Some really cool studies on the evolution of migration have been done in Germany, looking at blackcaps, a European species of warbler. If you look at migrant populations and non-migrant populations, and you bring them into the lab and you hybridize them, you can see that they show intermediate degrees of zugunruhe and intermediate degrees of how they would orient or navigate in these situations. So here we have a population of blackcaps that are breeding in Germany. Then we have those that are resident in Africa. You hybridize those and you look at their zugunruhe, it's right smack dab in the middle. So that's telling you it's a highly heritable trait, and it's probably a polygenic trait as well. And here's an interesting, some kind of more, so that's looking at the zugunruhe. They did some really cool orientation experiments with this. And let me try to show this to you. So let's see my biogeographic skills here. Oop. Oop. hopefully you can sort of recognize this as Europe. So we've got UK, Ireland, Iceland, Norway, the boot of Italy, Greece, Turkey. Here we have Northern Africa, Spain, and Portugal. So here you got Germany here, right? Close, probably. So we've got these German warblers, right? And they're within this migratory population. There are two different routes that they take. So if you look at the Western German population, what they do is migrate first to Spain and Portugal, and then they shoot down to Western Africa. Okay, you start looking over in Hungary and East Germany. What they do is they head down to past Greece, down to Turkey, and then they head down to East Africa, so Kenya, Tanzania, those types of areas. So what these German researchers did is they said, well, what if we hybridize those? Does it change? What is the orientation of the hybrids? Because they determine the orientation of these guys like that. We'll talk later about how they do that in a laboratory setting to determine what that orientation is. It's pretty slick. Well, this is what the hybrids do. Bam. They just go straight south. Right? So they show this intermediacy of navigation. So a very cool demonstration of how the orientation and other migratory behaviors really are highly heritable. All right. So there can be high heritability associated with navigation, but learning is also an important component of navigation in some species. When you see a bird that's way out of range during migration, in most cases that's a young bird. So here's an example of the breeding and migration areas associated with a species called the yellow-green vireo. Occasionally they'll show up on the Texas coast, very occasionally, but sometimes more often they're going to show up in Florida. And usually these vagrant birds that have made these errors in navigation and just flown the wrong way, they're young birds. And so that indicates either that learning is an important part of that, or if these are genetic mutants that are doing that. The reason we don't see older birds doing that is because they end up dying because of making these. So it still could be heritable in this situation. But we do know that learning is really important. In some species, like cranes, they have to be taught how to migrate. So the young cranes and geese will travel with the adults. And so in some of the studies to try to train whooping cranes to use different wintering areas, say in Florida, to reestablish old extirpated populations that would winter in Wisconsin, they had to train these birds to migrate. And so individuals would dress up in these white suits and use these ultralight flyers and train the birds to follow them between breeding and non-breeding areas. And then these more experienced whooping cranes now are taking the lead role in training the younger individuals how to navigate between these two areas. Now, indigo buntings, they do have a genetic propensity to be able to navigate in the right way, but they do have to at least be exposed to the right signals early in life. And so since they're nocturnal migrants, that's to the night sky. And we'll see that they use what's called a stellar compass, looking at star patterns, movements of stars to navigate. And they have to be exposed to that early in life, or their navigation skills won't develop. Some species that migrate in flocks, it's clear that individuals, when they get separated, they get confused, and they will sometimes join closely related flocks and fly the wrong route. This is called group entrapment. So here we have some Canada geese and a barnacle goose flying with them. It's been entrapped by this group because there's this strong social pull to migrate together. As I mentioned earlier, when we have migration patterns where you have, say, partial migrants that have different wintering grounds, possibly, but certainly when they have different breeding grounds, if these differences become consistent long term, where there's complete genetic isolation in these allopatric situations, it can lead to allopatric speciation. That may be what's going on with Swainson's thrush here. You see that they have these wintering grounds in South America and Central America, these two different populations, and they end up breeding in two different areas as well, an inland area and then a Pacific area. And they just have in this very teeny tiny area here a little bit of genetic overlap. So there's a little bit of genetic introgression or gene flow between these populations, but if that stops, then we really do have allopatric populations and can develop two species from the one Swainson's thrush. Same thing with common ring plovers in Europe. We see that they have different breeding grounds. In some cases, they have completely isolated wintering grounds too. And the isolation of the wintering grounds really isn't as important for the speciation process if they're not breeding. It's the isolation in the breeding grounds that could lead to the genetic isolation. Now, this isn't technically migration, but sometimes birds will have these one-time movements associated with more nomadic wandering, really. And we have cattle egrets all over North America now, but it appears that they first showed up from Africa into South America in the 1930s to establish these new populations, and the same thing has happened in parts of the Malay Peninsula here, going down into Indonesia and Australia. So I just want to end by talking about how climate change could impact migratory species of birds. If we have a situation where there's a shift for it to get warmer earlier, and that affects the abundance of food that is used, in that seasonal abundance of food used to feed nestlings, and it just shifts it a little bit earlier, and you see still most of the population having their peak breeding that overlaps with that, there's really not going to be much of an advantage for earlier breeders to track that earlier distribution of resources. However, if that seasonality becomes much earlier, then now you see, oh, these earlier breeders are going to get a big time advantage associated with this, and so you should see the populations tracking this so that if there's a genetic propensity to arrive earlier and there's significant fitness advantages of that, then the population should, those genes should increase in frequency and that population should shift to the left. Well, are we seeing birds tracking these changes and showing patterns consistent with B here? If you look at common house martins, you track them through the years and you see that their mean arrival dates on the breeding ground, which is the dark spots, and their mean departure from the breeding ground to the wintering grounds are showing the consistent shifts to earlier and earlier years. Now, is that associated with temperature changes? Probably, and we have better data on that from tree swallows. So if you see the mean laying date, it's getting earlier and earlier, and we see that that follows the pattern associated with mean mate temperatures. So mean mate temperatures are as they increase, we see that we get earlier laying dates. And that has been associated with time changes as well. All right, so that is a fairly long lecture today. The next one on navigation won't be as long, so I'll give you a little bit of a break there. Get out there and try to get your bird observations in. I know it's going to be raining a lot in Texas this week. So just try to find a window where you can get your 2 hours observations, and try to go to different habitats every time, because what I want you to start paying attention to is not only the seasonal differences in birds changing within a spot, but vary it, because you go to different habitats, you're going to get different birds. And so I want you to be able to pick that up. So I'll talk to you later.